I want to tell you something unusual before this story begins. I was not surprised. I need you to hold that, not as a detail, not as context, but as the defining fact of everything that follows. When Gerald stood up at that dinner table and pointed at me and said what he said in front of 12 people and the good dishes and the roast that Marie had been cooking since 11 that morning, I was not surprised. I had been sitting in that chair for 3 hours knowing it was coming, and I had a folder in my bag, and I had been waiting with the specific cold patience of a woman who has done her homework and is ready for the exam. I had been ready for this exam for 8 months. Let me tell you how I got ready. I am a financial analyst, not a forensic accountant. Though by the end of the 8 months, I had done enough forensic accounting to qualify for the title, but a financial analyst at a firm that manages institutional investments and whose primary value, in the estimation of the clients who pay us, is that we find things in numbers that other people miss. We find the discrepancy in the third decimal place. We find the pattern in the transaction history that looks like noise until you map it across 18 months, and then looks like something else entirely. I am very good at finding things. 8 months ago, I found something I had not been looking for. I had been updating my own personal accounts. A routine quarterly review, the kind of thing I did on a Sunday afternoon with a spreadsheet and coffee, the personal version of the professional work I did all week. I was reconciling 3 years of statements against my own records when I found a transaction pattern that, had I seen it in a client's portfolio, I would have flagged immediately. Small withdrawals, not my withdrawals, not unauthorized in the technical sense. The accounts were old accounts, joint accounts that had been opened when I was 19 and that I had never closed because closing them had never seemed necessary, because the person whose name was on them beside mine was my father, and fathers and daughters have joint accounts, and the accounts had been dormant for years, and I had simply never closed them. Not dormant, not withdrawn from by me, withdrawn from consistently across 31 months, in amounts between $200 and $600, timed at irregular intervals designed, and I use that word precisely, designed, to fall below the threshold that triggers automatic review. Someone understood how account monitoring worked. Someone had structured the withdrawals to avoid pattern detection. Gerald had worked in banking for 11 years before he retired. He understood how account monitoring worked. I spent 6 weeks confirming what I had found before I allowed myself to call it what it was. I am a professional, and professionals do not name things before the evidence is sufficient. And sufficient in my field means documentable, traceable, conclusive. 6 weeks of pulling every statement, cross-referencing every withdrawal against my own records, building the timeline with the care of someone who understands that the timeline has to be airtight before it can be presented. The timeline was airtight. 31 months. 67 individual transactions. The total came to $41,280. I called Lena. Lena had been my best friend since we were 22, and was the only person I called when I needed to say something out loud that I had only been saying inside my own head. She answered immediately, and I told her what I had found. And there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to understand she was doing what people who love you do when you tell them something terrible, measuring the distance between what you've said and what it means for you. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing yet. I'm going to wait." "Wait for what?" "For the right moment," I said. She said, "Vanessa, you found out your father stole $41,000 from you, and you're going to wait." "I found out 8 months ago," I said. The silence was different this time. "You've known for 8 months," she said. "Yes." "And you haven't said anything?" "No." "Why?" I thought about the honest answer. Because confronting him privately would give him the opportunity to manage the confrontation. I said, Gerald has been managing things privately his whole life. I wanted a specific set of conditions. I wanted witnesses. I wanted it to happen in a context where the managing was not available to him. That's very cold, Lena said. Yes, I said. Is that how you feel about it? Cold. I thought about it. I feel precise. I said, I feel like I have been given a problem that has a solution, and I have the solution, and I am waiting for the correct moment to present it. Vanessa. What? You're allowed to be angry, she said. You don't have to be a financial analyst about this. He stole from you. You're allowed to just be angry. I thought about the anger. It was there. I am not going to pretend it was not there. The anger was present and real, and had been present and real for 8 months, underneath the precision and the documentation and the airtight timeline. The anger at Gerald, who had stood at enough dinners in my life to fill a book of occasions and had said enough things at enough of those dinners to have produced in me the specific, comprehensive knowledge of a daughter who has been managing her father's assessment of her for 35 years and who has learned that the managing is the price of the relationship. But the anger was not useful in the way the documentation was useful. So I had set it aside. I had put it in a folder next to the bank records, and I had waited. The dinner was Marie's idea. Marie organized family dinners the way she organized everything in her life, with the earnest, effortful care of a woman who believed that a table set properly and food made from scratch and the physical assembly of the people she loved would solve, or at least contain, whatever the current difficulty was. The current difficulty was financial. Gerald and Marie were in the specific, grinding position of people who had made a series of decisions across a decade that had seemed individually manageable and were collectively not manageable, and the not manageability had arrived at a crisis point that Marie was dealing with by making a roast and inviting the family. I knew this because Marie had called me 3 weeks before the dinner. She had said, "We're having a difficult time, Vanessa. Financially. Your father, it's been a hard year. I just want the family together." I had said I would come. I had said it knowing what was in my bag. I want to tell you about the other people at the table because they matter to the story's specific geometry. Derek, my brother, who was 32 and who had been the recipient of Gerald's primary financial investment across his adult life, the down payment on his first apartment, the business loan that had not been repaid, the consistent low-level subsidization of a lifestyle that Derek had never been asked to match with his own income. Derek, who was sitting to Gerald's right with the specific ease of a man who does not know what is in his sister's bag. Marie at the head, nearest the kitchen. Gerald at the other head. 3 aunts and uncles who had been told it was a family dinner and had come with the uncomplicated expectation of a roast and conversation. And me, with my bag, with the folder, with 8 months. Gerald started somewhere around the second course. Not directly. Gerald never went directly, which was one of the things I knew about him that the bank records had only confirmed. He went the way he always went, through the subject, not at it, building toward the destination by making several stops that seemed unrelated until you saw the direction. He talked about the economy. He talked about how difficult things had been. He talked about the sacrifices that had been made and the decisions that hadn't paid off, and the specific unfairness of a financial situation that had been produced by forces beyond anyone's control. I ate my roast. Then he said, "The problem is that some people in this family have not contributed the way they should have. Some people have been in a position to help and haven't helped. And I think that needs to be said out loud." He looked at me, not subtly, not with the deniable vagueness of a man who can later say he wasn't referring to anyone specifically. He looked at me the way he had been looking at me for 35 years when he had a point to make, and I was the point. Derek looked at his plate. The aunts and uncles found the roast interesting. Marie said, "Gerald." He said, "No, this needs to be said. Vanessa has done well for herself. Vanessa has a good job, a good salary. And when her family has been struggling, when her parents have been struggling, there has been no offer of help. Nothing." He sat back. He had delivered it with the confidence of a man who knows his audience and has made his case. I put my fork down. I picked up my bag. I took out the folder. I did not open it immediately. I set it on the table beside my plate with the specific deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed this motion, because the motion matters, because the way you place something on a table tells the room something about whether you were expecting to need it. Gerald looked at the folder. Something moved in his face. Not recognition, not yet, but the specific pre-recognition awareness of a man who has been presented with something he was not expecting and whose body has registered the unexpectedness before his mind has caught up with why. I said, "I want to show the table something." My voice was level. This is the part one want to tell you carefully, because the levelness of my voice is not the levelness of a person who has no feeling. It is the levelness of a person who has spent 8 months with the feeling and has made a decision about what is useful and what is not, and has converted the feeling into documentation. I opened the folder. I did not slam it on the table. I did not distribute copies dramatically. I opened it and I took out 3 pages, a summary I had prepared specifically for this occasion, the way I would prepare an executive summary for a client presentation. 3 pages that contained the essential findings of 8 months of documentation in language that did not require a financial background to understand. I placed the pages in the center of the table. I said, "These are bank records. 3 years of statements from 2 accounts held jointly in my name and Gerald's name. Accounts I opened at 19 and never closed." The table looked at the pages. I said, "The records show 67 withdrawals across 31 months, totaling $41,280. None of those withdrawals were made by me." Gerald's face had arrived somewhere. I am going to describe it precisely and without embellishment, because precision is what this story is built on, and the face deserves the same precision as the records. His face had arrived at the expression of a man who has been in control of a narrative for 31 months and has just watched the narrative become a document. Not pale, not collapsed, not the exposed shock of a man encountering something he did not know existed. Something harder to look at than that. The expression of a man who knew exactly what the folder contained before I opened it, who had always known, who had been sitting at this table waiting to see if it would come and had decided, in the specific calculation of a man who has been managing things privately his whole life, that it probably wouldn't. It had come. Marie said, "What is this?" Not to me, to Gerald. Her voice had a quality I had heard rarely from Marie. Underneath the management, underneath the roast, and the table set properly, and the earnest belief that assembly solved things, something that was arriving from a place the management had not reached. Gerald said, "Marie, what is this, Gerald?" She said, not a question this time. He said, "It's not." $41,000, she said, reading from the summary page. 67 transactions. 31 months. The table was very still. Derek had looked up from his plate. I watched Derek look at the page and look at Gerald and do the specific, private mathematics of a child recalculating a parent. I knew what the calculation was because I had done it myself 8 months ago. The reordering of every interaction, every conversation, every family difficulty presented as external and unfortunate through the lens of what the records now revealed. Gerald said, I was going to pay it back. The table absorbed this. I was going to pay it back, he said again. We were going to be in a different position by now. The investments were supposed to. Gerald, I said. He stopped. I am not here to have the conversation about what you were going to do, I said. I am here because you stood up at this table and accused me in front of my family of failing to help when my family was struggling. I want the people at this table to have accurate information. I looked at my aunts and uncles. I looked at Derek. I looked at Marie, who was holding the summary page with the expression of a woman reading a document that is rearranging the architecture of the last 31 months of her life. I said, I did not fail to help. I helped $41,280 worth, without being asked, without my knowledge, and without being thanked for it. That is the accurate information. The table was silent in the specific way of a room that has just been given something it did not ask for, and cannot give back. Gerald said, Vanessa, let me explain. No, I said. He stopped. I don't want your explanation. I said, I have spent 8 months with the documentation, and whatever the explanation is, it does not change what the documentation says. I came tonight because you accused me publicly, and I wanted to respond publicly. I have responded. That's why I'm here. Marie set the page down. She said to Gerald, in the voice she used when she was not managing, You said it was the economy. Marie, you said it was the investments. You said it was the market. You said. She stopped. Her voice was doing something she was not going to be able to hold back. Not at this table, not in front of the aunts and uncles and Derek and the roast she had made since 11 in the morning and the daughter who had come with a folder. Gerald, you sat at this table and you blamed our daughter. I didn't know she'd found out, he said, which was not a denial, which was the most honest thing Gerald had said at a dinner table in 31 months. Derek said, quietly from the right side of the table, Dad. Just his name. Gerald looked at Derek. Derek had nothing else. Just the name, carrying everything. The reordering, the calculation, the specific weight of a son looking at a father who has been one thing his whole life and is now visibly another. I picked up the folder. I put it back in my bag. I looked at Marie. I said, I'm sorry, Mom. She shook her head. Not at me, at the situation, at the 31 months, at the roast and the table, and the family assembled by a woman who believed that assembly solved things and had not known that the thing she was trying to solve had been created by the man sitting at the other end of her table. I said, I'm going to go. Marie said, Vanessa, please. I'll call you, I said, this week. You and I will talk, but I'm going to go now. I stood up. Gerald said, Vanessa. I looked at my father. I had looked at my father at 1,000 dinners. I had looked at him across roasts and birthday cakes and holiday tables and the specific, ordinary geometry of a family that assembles regularly around food and considers the assembling to be evidence of itself. I had looked at him when he was saying things about me that were not accurate, and when he was saying things that were true, and when he was saying nothing at all, and I was simply in his peripheral vision, present and fine, and managing. I looked at him now. I said, the accounts are being closed Monday morning. I have spoken to the bank. He said, I was going to. Monday, I said, I got my coat. Derek followed me to the door. He said, Vanessa. I said, I know, Derek. I didn't. I know you didn't. I said, you didn't know. That's true, and it's also not the thing I need from you right now. What do you need? I thought about it. I need you to have a conversation with him that I don't have to be part of, I said. Whatever he tells you, whatever the explanation is, you deserve the explanation. I don't need it, but you do. He nodded. Are you okay? He said. I thought about the honest answer. Not Lena's version of the answer. Not you're allowed to be angry. My version. The version I had been carrying for 8 months alongside the documentation. I'm precise, I said. I'll be okay once I'm precise about what comes next. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has grown up alongside a sister he has not fully understood, and who is beginning to understand her now, at 32, on the doorstep of a dinner that has ended badly. I hugged him briefly. I left. The drive home was ordinary, not cinematic, not the significant November streets of the engagement party story, not the corporate landscape of the contract story, not the canal light of the Amsterdam story. Just streets. The streets between Gerald and Marie's house and my apartment, driven in the specific, unremarkable way of someone going from one place to another in the dark. I called Lena. She answered immediately. I said, "It happened. How did it go?" I thought about the roast and the folder and Gerald's face and Marie reading the summary page and Derek saying Dad in the voice that carried everything. It went the way things go when you are prepared and the other person is not, I said. Are you okay? I'm closing the accounts Monday, I said. Vanessa. Both of them. I spoke to Robert at the bank last week. Monday morning it's done. That's not what I asked, she said. I drove. I know it's not, I said. So, I thought about it the way I thought about everything, specifically without rushing toward a conclusion that felt right before it was accurate. Gerald took $41,000 from me across 31 months, I said. He structured the withdrawals to avoid detection. He retired from banking and used what he knew about account monitoring to take money from his daughter without her knowledge. And tonight he sat at a table and accused me of not helping. Yes, Lena said. I am not okay with that. I said, I don't think I'm supposed to be okay with that. I think okay is not the available response to that, and anyone who tells me it should be is wrong. No, she said. You're not supposed to be okay with it. I'm accurate about it. I said, I have been accurate about it for 8 months. I have the documentation and the timeline and the closed accounts, and I said what needed to be said in front of the people who needed to hear it, and I know exactly what happened and what it cost me, and what I am going to do going forward. What are you going to do going forward? I pulled into my parking space. I turned the car off. I sat in the dark for a moment. Marie is going to call me this week, I said. And I'm going to take that call because Marie made the roast and assembled the family and did not know about the accounts and does not deserve to lose her daughter on top of everything else. And Gerald, I thought about Gerald. I thought about 11 years of banking, about the knowledge of account monitoring structures, about 31 months and 67 transactions, and the specific, careful spacing of them, about the dinner tonight and the accusation and the confidence of a man presenting his case to an audience before his daughter arrived with a folder. Gerald, I said, is a conversation I am not having this week. Next week. I don't know, I said. I don't have a timeline for Gerald. That's honest, Lena said. Yes, I said. I am trying to be honest about everything I don't know. I don't know if there's a version of this that ends with Gerald and me at another dinner table. I don't know if I want that. I know what he did, and I know it was not a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. It was 31 months of consistent, structured, deliberate withdrawal from his daughter's account, and it was followed by a dinner where he accused her of not helping. Those two things together make a picture that I am not ready to put a frame on yet. Okay, Lena said. Okay, I said. We stayed on the phone for a while longer without talking about Gerald, about other things, the ordinary things that best friends talk about when the hard conversation has been had, and what's left is just the being together across distance. When we hung up, I sat in my car for another few minutes. The folder was in my bag. 67 transactions, 31 months, $41,280. Monday morning, I would walk into Robert's office and close the accounts, and that specific 31-month exposure would be over. The gap that had existed in my financial life between what I had and what Gerald had access to would be closed. The documentation would remain. The timeline would remain. What I did with the remaining question, which was the question of Gerald, of what he was to me, and I was to him, and whether the picture I had described to Lena was one I could eventually put a frame on, that question remained open. I was not going to answer it tonight. Tonight, I had done what I came to do. I had sat at a dinner table where my father publicly accused me of failing my family. I had taken out a folder. I had placed 3 pages in the center of a table set properly with the good dishes and the roast made since 11. I had said, these are bank records. I had said, I did not fail to help. I had said, the accounts are being closed Monday. And I had left, not triumphant, not healed, not the clean, sealed ending that stories like this one sometimes pretend to offer. Just accurate, precise, done with the part that needed doing. Monday the accounts would close. After that, whatever came next, whatever I decided came next. On my timeline, mine,